Close your eyes and imagine this. The great towers of Western media stand silent. BBC, CNN, Washington, Paris. But their silence is broken not by presidents or generals, but by the voices of children, laughter, song, and a vow we will never betray our country. These words do not echo through London or New York. They rise instead from the red soil of Burkina Faso, a land too often dismissed as poor, unstable, irrelevant. Yet today, its children speak with a conviction that bends history. For decades, the outside world wrote the story of Africa. They called it fragile, dependent, incapable. But in Ouagadougou, a decree has been signed that dares to change that script forever. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has declared that education shall no longer end with books alone. From now on, it will begin with discipline, civic duty, and loyalty to the homeland. Is this the birth of a new Africa? One whose young can no longer be manipulated by foreign powers? Or is it a dangerous demand for loyalty before knowledge? Do not look away. What comes next may change how we read the map. Subscribe and keep watching, because this is not just an educational reform. It is a seed planted in the nation's soul. The decree came quietly, signed not in the glare of foreign cameras, but in the sober offices of a government that has decided to rewrite its destiny. In one stroke of a pen, Ibrahim Traoré announced that no student in Burkina Faso could advance to higher education without first proving something deeper than academic knowledge. From this day forward, every young Burkinabe would have to complete what is now known as patriotic immersion, a national rite of passage. It is not optional. It is not ceremonial. It is binding law. Those who pass major national exams, whether the General High School Certificate, Vocational Training Certificate, or the Professional Diploma, must now pause their academic journey to take part in this program. Without it, there is no entry to universities, no technical schools, no path into the professions. A certificate of patriotic immersion has become as vital as a diploma itself. A second passport, stamped not with visas, but with the weight of loyalty. The decree defines 3 pillars. The first is physical training, structured exercise, endurance drills, health education. It is not merely about muscle or stamina, but about teaching young men and women the resilience to stand upright in a world that has often tried to bend them. The second is civic education, a clear instruction in the rights and duties of citizenship. Students are taught that freedom without responsibility is fragile, that dignity is not given, but earned. They learn not as subjects of a distant government, but as citizens entrusted with a republic. The third is patriotic lessons, the retelling of Burkina Faso's history, its battles for independence, its heroes, its martyrs, its scars. In those classrooms, the soil of the past is turned so that seeds of memory can be planted in young hearts. This was not designed to be symbolic. The law has teeth. Students who refuse will be barred from further studies and assigned community service until they comply. Only the rarest exemptions, signed by government authority, can excuse participation. And to guarantee seriousness, multiple ministries are tasked with coordination. Secondary education, defense and veterans, security, higher education. This is not just a classroom project. It is a collaboration between teachers, soldiers, and civil servants, all working to mold a new kind of citizen. The details, length of immersion, training centers, curriculum specifics, will be set by joint ministerial orders. But the foundation has already been laid. Every student who passes through will emerge with a certificate that speaks louder than grades, a declaration that before they studied for themselves, they stood for their country. In this sense, the reform is more than pedagogy. It is statecraft. It is an attempt to forge unity in a nation where division has often been exploited by external powers. For young Burkinabe, this decree is both challenge and opportunity. The challenge lies in the extra burden, weeks, perhaps months of immersion before continuing their studies. But the opportunity is vast, a chance to build discipline, forge resilience, and connect with peers across regions and ethnicities. No longer divided by tribe or political party, Young people will share the same rite of passage, the same anthem, the same oath. The reform transforms education from a race for individual advancement into a collective act of nationhood. In the words of one observer, this is not a school policy. It is a seed planted in the nation's soul. And seeds, once planted, demand time. They demand rain and storms. They demand patience. The decree is not about the next exam cycle. It is about 50 years from now, when those who first marched through patriotic immersion will sit in parliament, run ministries, command regiments, teach in classrooms. It is about shaping a generation that carries in its veins the memory of its land. But the true measure of this reform was not written in offices or laws. It was revealed in something far less predictable, far more powerful, the voices of the children themselves. But the true measure of this decree was not in offices or signatures. It was in the voices of children. The moment came not in parliament, nor in the halls of power, but in schoolyards and dusty streets. Cameras captured groups of children, some in crisp uniforms, others barefoot in sandals, standing shoulder to shoulder. Their voices were unpolished, their grammar imperfect, but their conviction unshakable. We will never betray our country. We are loyal to our flag. We have the best president in the world. This was not a staged rally, not the rhetoric of seasoned politicians. These were ordinary students, many from modest families, speaking words no government official could have scripted. Their declarations spread like wildfire, first across Burkina Faso's television channels, then across West African social media. Within days, the chants echoed in Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, and Cameroon. What began as a decree had become a movement. The emotional power lay in contrast. For years, analysts said Africa's youth were restless, disillusioned, desperate to escape to Europe or America. Yet here were children in Ouagadougou, claiming their identity in the boldest possible way, not in the language of exile, but in the language of belonging. Their voices shook not only their own nation, but the assumptions of an entire continent. The reaction inside Burkina Faso was immediate. Parents who had endured decades of coups and instability began to feel something long absent: pride. They saw in their children not just students memorizing facts for exams, but young citizens affirming a future rooted in loyalty. Teachers, often reduced to conveyor belts for diplomas, suddenly felt restored as guardians of national identity. Even soldiers tasked with implementing the decree found unexpected legitimacy, realizing that this was not a burden imposed from above, but a spirit rising from below. Across West Africa, the ripple was more complex. In Ghana, commentators admitted painfully that no group of students could speak with such love for their leaders. In Kenya, where headlines often scream of protests and discontent, the voices from Burkina Faso sounded like a dream from another continent. In Uganda and Cameroon, where aging rulers cling to power, the idea that children could look at their president with genuine admiration felt almost impossible. This contrast cut deep. It was not only about Traore, it was about the very essence of leadership, what it means to inspire, what it means to earn loyalty without coercion. When the children of Burkina Faso spoke, they posed an unspoken question to the rest of Africa. What would it take for your children to say the same? And then came the most powerful fusion of words and symbols. In a separate broadcast, Ibrahim Traoré himself addressed the youth. He warned them of manipulation by foreign powers, urging them to guard their minds against propaganda and their hearts against division. The new Burkina Faso, he said, needs new patriotism, new citizens. His voice met theirs. His decree met their chants. It was the moment when policy and passion merged, when authority was answered with authenticity. On the streets, murals began to appear, painted slogans declaring "loyal to our flag" and "the future belongs to the brave." Online, hashtags spread through Francophone Africa, celebrating the decree. What might have been dismissed as bureaucratic law was now alive in art, music, conversation, and identity. Of course, critics raised alarms. Some inside and outside the country warned of the dangers: blind nationalism, the risk of stifling dissent, Western media framed it as militarization of youth, yet those headlines were drowned out by an undeniable truth. The images of children shouting loyalty with their own breath, their own conviction, resonated louder than any editorial. For the Burkinabe themselves, it was not theory, it was vindication. Decades of instability had robbed them of pride. Now, through the voices of their children, they felt the stirrings of a different future. A future where dignity was not borrowed from abroad but rooted in their own soil. And yet, beneath the euphoria lies a question that cannot be ignored. If children can shout loyalty with such strength, what will happen when they grow into citizens with power? If children can shout loyalty, what will happen when they grow into citizens? In the homes of Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso, parents are talking differently about their children. For years, the greatest fear was not violence or hunger, but abandonment. The knowledge that their sons and daughters would leave for Europe or America, chasing futures that the soil of Burkina Faso seemed unable to provide. Now, the decree of patriotic immersion has altered that fear. Before entering universities or technical schools, every child must carry the flag, march in discipline, and learn the story of their nation. Parents who once worried about losing their children to migration now whisper with cautious pride, "They will first belong here." Teachers, too, feel a restoration of purpose. For decades, their classrooms were conveyor belts of examination, producing graduates whose only ambition was personal advancement. Civic duty was treated as a ceremonial footnote, history as a dusty subject, discipline as punishment rather than character. But under this reform, teachers are asked to mold citizens, not just students. The lesson is no longer only about solving equations, but about solving the riddle of nationhood, about teaching that dignity is not granted by foreign approval, but by loyalty to one's people. For many educators, this is the moment they reclaim their vocation as guardians of identity. For the youth themselves, the decree creates both weight and honor. On one hand, the pressure is undeniable. Advancement is impossible without immersion, and refusal invites both penalties and public shame. To skip the program is to mark oneself as disloyal. Yet on the other hand, there is a pride that glows. Completing patriotic immersion is not just a requirement. It becomes a badge of belonging, a rite of passage into adulthood, a certificate that says, "I stood for my country before I stood for myself." In a society fractured by coups and political rivalries, such a shared experience may bind a generation together. Politically, the decree strikes at the root of division. In many African nations, loyalty flows first to party, tribe, or foreign sponsor. Burkina Faso has long suffered the same fractures. But with this reform, Ibrahim Traoré attempts to reverse the order. Loyalty must flow first to the nation. Leaders may come and go, but the flag remains. If successful, this shift could insulate citizens against manipulation by short-term promises or divisive rhetoric. To betray the nation would become unthinkable, even if one disagreed with policies or politicians. This is where the decree touches the heart of political culture. It challenges the very logic of power brokering. In places like Ghana or Kenya, elections are battles of party machines, fueled by ethnic blocs and external donors. But if a generation grows up with the oath of patriotism as its first memory of adulthood, then the calculus of politics changes. Voters will be harder to bribe, harder to divide, harder to sway with slogans imported from abroad. They will see betrayal of the country as betrayal of the self. And here lies the personal stake for Traoré. Abroad, critics accuse him of authoritarianism. Yet domestically, this decree signals that his project is not simply about personal rule, but about building something enduring, a social contract that outlives his tenure. In this sense, patriotic immersion is not only a policy, but a foundation stone in what some already call the Ibrahim Traoré legacy. Every child who passes through the program becomes part of that legacy, carrying it into their studies, careers, and future leadership. Still, the decree is not without shadows. Some analysts warn that compulsory patriotism can blur into coercion, that dissent may be stigmatized as disloyalty. Others caution that while today's program inspires, tomorrow's leaders might weaponize it for obedience rather than enlightenment. History offers both hope and warning. Education can liberate, but it can also indoctrinate. Yet for now, inside Burkina Faso, the overwhelming effect is cohesion. Families see their sacrifices honored. Teachers regain dignity. Students feel both tested and bonded. Soldiers and civil servants find legitimacy in a project embraced from below. In a nation scarred by instability and coups, such unity is rare, almost revolutionary. But revolutions are fragile. Seeds sprout quickly, yet storms can just as quickly uproot them. The decree has planted something in the soil of Burkina Faso. The question is whether it will grow into a forest of citizens or wither into ritual. But a legacy is only as strong as the storms it survives. What began as a domestic decree did not remain within Burkina Faso's borders. In Washington, think tanks and policymakers watched with unease. On the one hand, some scholars noted that compulsory civic training was hardly alien to American history. The early republic demanded that its citizens learn duty alongside literacy. But there was also a sharper recognition. A generation trained to question Western narratives, to doubt foreign influence, would be far more difficult to sway in future negotiations. For diplomats, this was not merely an education reform. It was a recalibration of soft power. If the youth of Burkina Faso grow up seeing the United States not as a model, but as a manipulator, then the traditional tools of persuasion will lose their grip. In Paris, the reaction was sharper still. French commentators framed the decree as yet another strike in Traoré's campaign to dismantle the old colonial scaffolding. For decades, Paris maintained influence through elites educated in its universities, fluent in its culture, tethered by invisible threads of dependence. But if the next generation is trained from adolescence to distrust external interference, those threads may finally snap. To French eyes, patriotic immersion is not an educational policy, but a cultural barricade, a line drawn against the old empire. Across Africa, the debate was fierce. In Ghana, commentators admitted that their own education system had failed to instill loyalty, leaving citizens more devoted to parties than to nationhood. In Kenya, where political protests erupt like seasonal storms, journalists asked whether such a program could ever unite their fractured youth. In Uganda and Cameroon, where presidents have sat in power for decades, the question cut deeper. Would children there ever speak of their leaders with such conviction? The comparisons were painful, but also galvanizing. If Burkina Faso could dare to demand patriotism before advancement, why could others not follow? Regional organizations were divided. Some voices within the African Union praised the decree as a model for citizenship education. ECOWAS, meanwhile, remained cautious, wary of endorsing a policy that Western partners viewed with suspicion. Yet even their hesitation betrayed the truth. Burkina Faso had introduced an idea too significant to ignore. To many observers, the reform reflects something larger, a long-term blueprint, a vision stretching far beyond present politics. Supporters frame it as nothing less than Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, the planting of seeds for a generation that will carry Africa into a future defined by sovereignty rather than submission. Whether one celebrates or fears it, the decree has become a mirror, showing each nation not just what Burkina Faso is doing, but what it lacks within its own borders. And so the world watches, some with admiration, some with suspicion, but all with the knowledge that an experiment is unfolding in the Sahel, one whose outcome could redefine the balance between Africa and the powers that once sought to shape it. The world is watching, but is it celebrating or conspiring? Every decree is a beginning, not an end. The patriotic immersion of Burkina Faso has already reshaped classrooms, conversations, and headlines. But its true weight lies in the years to come. What will this generation become? And how will the world respond? The opportunities are vivid. A nation long fractured by coups and foreign meddling may finally cultivate a youth harder to divide. Instead of seeing education as a private ladder, children will see it as a bridge to collective responsibility. Shared immersion may dissolve lines of tribe and party, forging unity in a place where division has been the constant weapon of outsiders. If the program holds, Burkina Faso could raise a generation immune to the manipulations that once enslaved their parents. Yet the risks are equally sharp. Compulsory patriotism walks a narrow line. Today it inspires, tomorrow it could suffocate. If future governments twist the program into a tool of control, immersion could shift from education to indoctrination. The very oath that unites could be turned against those who dissent. History is filled with such turns, where love of country was demanded rather than nurtured, and the soil of freedom became barren with uniformity. Economically, the reform's ripple may reach even further. A disciplined, cohesive youth could become the workforce that stabilizes Burkina Faso, attracting investment, building institutions, defending sovereignty. But should external pressures mount, sanctions, propaganda, even covert attempts to destabilize, the burden will fall hardest on this same generation. Their loyalty will be tested not in classrooms, but in the harsh realities of politics and economics. And then there is the regional question. If other nations imitate the model, Africa could enter a new era of education tied to sovereignty. If they reject it, Burkina Faso may stand isolated, admired but besieged. The stakes are continental. For some, patriotic immersion is a laboratory of freedom. For others, a rehearsal of authoritarianism. Ultimately, the decree is not about textbooks or drills. It is about identity. Who the young Burkinabe will choose to be, and whether that choice will remain theirs to make. In the words of one teacher, we are no longer only raising graduates. We are raising citizens. That is both promise and warning, so the path ahead is not smooth. It is a road of light and shadow, of unity and temptation, of pride and peril. The decree has planted a seed, but will it grow into a forest of strong, independent citizens, or will storms uproot it before it can take root? And that question leads us to the heart of Africa's future. The story of Burkina Faso's decree is not only about classrooms, certificates, or examinations. It is about the planting of a seed placed into the soil of a nation long battered by coups, long tested by poverty, long underestimated by the world. Seeds are fragile at first, easily crushed, easily ignored. Yet given time, they grow into forests, reshaping landscapes, shifting horizons. Today, the children of Burkina Faso are more than students. They are the carriers of a new social contract, proof that patriotism can be taught not as blind obedience, but as lived responsibility. Their chants, raw and unpolished, remind us that dignity begins with belonging. Parents who once feared exile now see a future worth staying for. Teachers who once felt irrelevant now guard the nation's memory. And a generation is rising that may one day look back on this moment as the birth of its strength. This is why the decree is already spoken of as part of the Ibrahim Traoré legacy. It is not only about his presidency, but about a future that stretches beyond his time in office. It is about preparing citizens who cannot be easily divided, who understand that the flag belongs to all, not to factions. It is a vision not of one leader, but of a continent daring to claim its destiny. Some call it Ibrahim Traoré Vision 2050, a blueprint for sovereignty, dignity, and unity carried forward by the youth themselves. But legacies are not secured in parchment and ink. They are secured in hearts that remember, in voices that refuse betrayal, in hands that build a different tomorrow. For this reason, the decree is not simply law. It is promise, and it is warning. If nurtured, it may inspire a forest of strong, independent citizens. If betrayed, it may become another scar in Africa's long history of broken hopes. The choice rests not in the world's capitals, but in the classrooms and communities of Burkina Faso itself. So let us end with a question that belongs not only to Burkinabe, but to all of us. If one small, landlocked nation can plant such a seed, what stops the rest of Africa from doing the same? Do not just watch history, walk with it. Subscribe, share, and keep this story alive.